Nothing is impossible. All of us have heard this growing up. It's the anthem of every motivational talk. We're even told that the word impossible itself says, I am possible. It's a beautiful sentiment, a battle cry, a success mantra. And yet, if we're being honest with ourselves, it's not entirely true. Good morning, everyone. I am Palkesh Asawa, an alumnus of Choithram International, a chartered accountant and an advocate. And over the years, as a student, as an employee working in a large organization, and now as an independent consultant, I've had the opportunity to observe how success and failure play out in real life. And slowly, through these experiences, I began to be disillusioned and uncomfortable with the idea of possibility as we usually understand it. When we say that everything is possible, we subtly imply that if you did not achieve your goals, you simply did not try hard enough. But this kind of thinking ignores the circumstances. It ignores the starting point. It ignores 100 different factors that also affect your lives. And so I realized that it's not really a useful question to ask if something is possible. A far more important question is whether it is probable. Possibility asks, can it happen? But probability asks, how likely is it? What are the chances? How often does it actually happen? And that shift changes everything. You know, when we chartered accountants evaluate the financial statements of a company, we do not ask if it is perfect. We just ask if it is probable enough that the financial statements are correct. And I realized that this isn't just how we should evaluate financial statements, it's also how we should evaluate life. So if your goal is to be, say, a CEO or a writer or a film star, and if you ask, is it possible? The answer is almost always going to be yes. But that yes doesn't get you anywhere. Instead, if you ask, is it probable? Well, now you have to pause and think before you answer. And that thinking leads to the right kind of mindset. So what this framework does is, it changes two things. It changes how we judge the outcomes in our life, and it changes how we influence those outcomes. Values in this context simply means how we look at success and failure in light of the efforts that we are making. And when we accept that life is probabilistic, the first value that naturally follows is humility. Now, humility is not about underrating yourself. It's just about accepting that success isn't entirely our own, that many other factors also play a role. Let me share a small example. When I was studying for my CA exams, just a couple hours before my exam, I happened to come across a practice question which was slightly unique and different. I solved that question, and when I went into the exam hall, I saw that the same question appeared in the paper, word for 16 marks. Now, I do credit my hard work, but I also admit that I happened to be in the right place at the right time. Effort matters, but it's not the full story. And when you see that, then humility is not an option. It's just being honest with reality. Now, while success requires humility, failure requires compassion. Firstly, compassion for others. Because when we know that life is probabilistic, it's not fair to judge anyone without knowing their full story. But more importantly, compassion also for yourself. Because we may work really hard and push the probability, say 90% in our favor, but that still leaves 10% to chance. Because we can't control everything, we may still fail despite our best efforts. At these moments, showing compassion for ourselves allows us to move forward without being crushed by life. At this point, a natural question arises that if we don't control everything in our lives, does that mean that our efforts are meaningless? I say no. What this framework asks is not to give up effort, but to give up the illusion of control. Because let's face it, we really do not control everything in our lives. And that may sound unsettling at first, but here's the important part. We may not control our lives, but we can certainly influence our lives. And influence may sound insignificant at first, but over time, when influence is applied thoughtfully and consistently, it can lead to significant changes. So, how do we exercise that influence in the best possible manner? If life is probabilistic, how do we act with that information? And that gets us to the second half of this framework, actions. Now, the first action is rather simple. Since life is driven by probability, our focus is not to control the outcomes. It is to nudge the odds in our favor. We do not know what will happen, but we can certainly take actions that slightly increase the probability that our desired outcome may happen. That's how you nudge the odds in your favor. So if your goal is to be, say, a lawyer, then spending time in a courthouse and watching a trial is a nudge. If you want a job, then spending 20 minutes reading about a company is a nudge. If you want a longer and healthier life, then putting down a cigarette is a nudge. None of this guarantees success, but that's not the point. We're not trying to control the outcomes, remember. We're only trying to increase the probability in our favor a small percentage at a time. But when these small nudges are repeated day after day, over time, they add up, they stack. So it's not just about nudging the odds, it's also about stacking the odds in our favor. When we repeatedly take actions that slightly increase the chances that we may succeed, over time, it amounts to a significant chance for success, which is the best thing that we can ask for in a probabilistic life. But for nudging and stacking the odds to work, there is one more thing that we need to realize. Since life is driven by probability, there will be ups and downs. There will be good times and bad times. Now, imagine someone going through a particularly bad time, and it affects them so much that they couldn't even survive. In the future, their life might have taken a positive turn. But since they were not even alive to see it, the positive side of probability was useless for them. And that gets us to the second crucial insight. We can only benefit from probability if we are resilient enough to stay afloat in the face of failure. So staying afloat in the face of failure is the most important part. Morgan Housel talks about this concept in his book, The Psychology of Money. He says that in investing, success does not come from picking the right stock. Out of, say, 100 stocks that you invest in, only about 5 may give you profits, and you don't know which ones. The important part is not to pick the right stock. Those 5% can give you enough profit to cover the losses made on the 95% trades. But you can only do that if you are in the market long enough to give the opportunity to those 5% to return the profits. If you just exit when you make a loss, you can never give your stocks an opportunity to turn around and give you a profitable portfolio. The important part is this. In life, it is important to take a right decision. But it is much more important to survive a wrong decision. That's the key insight that we need to learn from this framework. Think of a student who has done everything right. They've been preparing for an entrance exam for, say, 2 years. They have attended all the classes, solved all the questions. They have stacked the odds in their favor. But they make one mistake. They tie their identity to that exam. On the day of the exam, something doesn't work out. They have a bad morning. They miss the cutoff by a minor percentage. But to them, it feels like the end of the world. So they walk out. They quit. That student did not fail because of lack of ability. They failed because they couldn't find a way to stay afloat in the face of failure. As students, we have to remember that we are not preparing for an exam. We are preparing for the life that begins after the exam. In a probabilistic life, the longer you are playing the game, the better your chances are of success. And that's the key insight that we need to imagine. Now, since the life is driven by probability, many bad things will happen. Failures are bound to come. There will be failed applications. There will be missed cutoffs. There will be bad business ideas. This is bound to happen. Staying afloat is not about avoiding failure. It is about making sure that no single failure is your last one. It is about building a character so strong that a single failure or a setback cannot wipe you out. In a probabilistic life, success does not come from getting everything right. It comes from surviving the downside long enough for the odds to work in your favor. Now, I want to be clear about one thing. These values and actions that I talked about today, these are my conclusions. You may look at this framework and you may arrive at entirely different conclusions. For you, having a probabilistic view of life may mean other values such as courage or patience or gratitude. Or you may think that having a probabilistic life means other actions are more important. For example, being more prompt or acting more decisively or being more adaptable. And that's completely fine. The point of this talk is not to offer a complete framework for life. The point is to offer a different way of thinking. The key takeaway that I want to share is this. Life may be full of possibilities, but it is driven by probabilities. So the next time, don't ask if something is possible. Ask if it is probable, and then go nudge the odds in your favor. Thank you so much.